The first thing we're going to talk through is just a little bit about kind of the standards in AP literature and composition that have to do with characterization. So the first one, it says description, dialogue, and behavior reveal characters to readers. So obviously, you know, as you're reading, paying attention to the way a character is described by the narrator or by other characters, conversations the character has, and the things that they do, their behaviors, all can let us know more about them. Perspective, so characters reveal their perspectives and their biases through the words they use, the details they provide in the text, the organization of their thinking, and the decisions they make and the actions they take. And then motivation, characters can infer a character's, or readers can infer a character's motives from that character's actions or inactions. So some key terms that might be helpful for us to be aware of as we're thinking about characterization are cultural norms. So those being shared rules and expectations that members of society adhered to. Conflict, you know, I'm sure in school you studied external versus internal conflict, you know, and we know that a story can't exist without conflict. Conflict is what drives the story. So it's a struggle between opposing forces. It doesn't necessarily have to be people. A conflict is external when it pits a character against something outside of himself or herself. So again, another person, or it could be like something in nature, it could be society. And then a conflict could be internal when opposing forces are two drives or two impulses, you know, some kind of like conflict within the person's own self. A protagonist, we like to think of, like, I think a lot of times in younger grades, a protagonist is like the good guy, but I don't think we have to think about it necessarily like that. I think it's the most neutral and broadly applicable term for the main character, whether they're male or female, and whether they're a hero or not. And then an antagonist, again, I don't know if you've been taught that kind of like the antagonist is the bad guy. I don't think it has to be the bad guy. I think it's just the force that opposes the protagonist. So that doesn't necessarily have to be even a person. That could be a non-human force. And then a foil is a character that serves as a contrast to another character. Writers can build characterization in several ways, including, like we've talked about, character description, dialogue and inner thoughts, character behavior, and character description can include the way a character looks, dresses, talks, walks, thinks, and more. Writers almost always describe their characters, but it usually goes beyond just like a basic physical description. In fact, sometimes they won't describe what they are like physically, but focus more on kind of like the internal parts of the character. And when a writer does describe a character, you want to kind of consider what's described for you and what they left for you to kind of figure out and determine for yourself. And then as far as the dialogue and the inner thoughts go, another way, wait, hold on, got away from myself. Another way you can learn about the character is to examine the way he or she speaks or how they write. And we want to pay attention to kind of like their speech style, their patterns, because that can show their culture, their socioeconomic status, their values, their intelligence, and more. As far as character behavior, the saying goes, action speaks louder than words, and this is true of fictional characters as well. One of the biggest ways to learn about a character is to observe their behavior. You can learn virtually anything about a character, just like you can learn virtually anything about a person based on their actions. So this character iceberg is something that I like to share with my students because I do think it's helpful. I think this helps to kind of break down the fact that characters are complex. So just like an iceberg where, you know, you have just a little bit on like over the surface of the water, there's so much more of it that's beneath. And so on top of the iceberg, we have a character's actions, we have their speech, we have their thoughts. And then below you can see all of the things that kind of may drive those actions, speech, and thought. So for example, their motivations, their fears, their family, their relationships, their social status, all of those things are kind of like the underlying drivers of who a person is. So something we want students to do is move beyond just identifying what's on the surface, the actions, the speech, and the thoughts, and to really go beneath and think about what forms a complex character and what's going on with the character more than just on the surface. So some questions that might guide your analysis. How is the character described physically, emotionally, or psychologically? Is the character's name significant? Sometimes it is, and sometimes that kind of gives you a hint as to who the character may be, or something about their background or a connection we can make. How does a character's background, motivation, or desires affect what they say and do? What do conflicts reveal about characters and the central ideas in the text? How does a contrasting character highlight values and beliefs addressed in the text? Are there contradictions between how characters behave and how they actually think and act? And then can you identify a conflict or conflicts that involve the character, and what does the nature of those conflicts reveal about a possible deeper meaning of the story? So have you seen this Pixar short?
I don't think so.
Okay. So I think that this is a fun one to watch for characterization. So what I'd like for you to do, again, if you have, paper, or if you, paper is probably the easiest way to do this. The iceberg, I did put the iceberg in the classroom. So you should be able to see it. But I'll put that slide up really quickly. So on the top of the iceberg, you're going to want to think about what the mother's actions are, what her maybe speech reflects, and what her thoughts are. And then below, you want to kind of think about all of those things that we talked about, maybe her motivation, her secrets, her fears, her culture, all of that. So those are the things I want you to kind of think about. So what's on the surface level and then what's below. Does that make sense? It says, read this passage from The Great Gatsby for the literary elements the author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, uses to characterize Tom Buchanan in chapter 1. It says, underline or circle words you aren't familiar with, and I know you don't have like a paper copy in front of you, so do what you can. And then how is he described physically, emotionally, and psychologically? Consider his dialogue. What adjectives would you use to describe him based on your noticings? What can we tell about the way the narrator and Tom interact with each other? So if you look at this text, you can see it's not very long. And then when you get to the end, I have a chart for you. And so it says, fill in the chart with text evidence and adjectives that support your understanding of Tom. So what I'd like for you to do is, if you will just read through that. And again, it says to kind of take note of maybe words you're not sure about, adjectives that are used to describe him. And then kind of the way I did, I took like the word sturdy, which comes from the text, and then I chose an adjective that I thought went along with that. Does that make sense? Yeah, so his supercilious manner kind of means that he's not really very easily intimidated. And then,
well, like easily intimidated or intimidated?
He's not easily intimidated. So yeah, you could say that he is intimidating. And then you said fractiousness. And so it says, yeah, his speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. So kind of the idea of like being unruly. So yeah, those are two good words to pull out. What would you say as far as the way the narrator describes Tom? What textual evidence did you pull out for him? Like if we look at the first paragraph, it says the front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan in writing clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. So we have the fact that he comes in, he's wearing writing clothes. So like we have a description at least of what he's wearing, right? Like that was one of the things we kind of talked about earlier. So we can maybe wonder like, why would he be wearing writing clothes specifically? And then it says in the next paragraph, he had changed since his New Haven years. So I guess the question for me is kind of like, what is it that has caused him to change, or how has he changed? But it says, if we keep reading, it says now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his writing clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. So kind of like what you described, where you were saying like he's pretty masculine. You know, it talks about like how he is dominant, kind of that he's proud, he's not easily intimidated. It says he seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulders moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. So I think you mentioned the fact that he is described as cruel, right? So if we had to put an adjective maybe with the description of cruel body, how might you describe him? If we could just sum that up in one word.
Intimidating?
Okay, yeah, I think so. Yeah, you could say like intimidating, or he kind of has this like overpowering presence, right? Like it kind of feels like he's like, it says he's like always leaning aggressively forward, kind of, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think so. What about, it describes his eyes as two shining, arrogant eyes. And it says that they had established dominance. So if we had to just kind of sum that up in one word, what might we say? I think so. You could say that he's prideful, or kind of that he has this air of like superiority. I wanted to say, so like, if we keep reading, it says his speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. So if we think about that sentence and the way his voice is described, how might we kind of like sum him up there? Okay. I mean, maybe the word harsh, right? Like it talks about how his voice kind of has this like gruff, husky tenor, and that he kind of has this impression of being like unruly or fractious. So yeah, maybe harsh. It says there was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. What do you make of the fact that they describe his eyes as kind of like flashing about restlessly? What does that maybe tell us about him? Okay, yeah, maybe like, yeah, nervous, or maybe he's impatient. I mean, it just said that, you know, it seems like he kind of wants to impress him. So yeah, maybe he's nervous about the interaction. And then it says, turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. So even the way he like moves the other character around, the other character's name is Nick, the way he moves him around, he kind of just like moves him by one arm, you know, again, it kind of just gives us this idea that he is kind of like masculine, maybe superior, maybe this idea of like being overpowering, all of that. Okay, so for example, the book that we just looked at, if you said, you know, in the novel The Great Gatsby, and then you'd put the author presents, and then you could say what he presents. And then you would say in order to, and then you would have some kind of textual understanding based on the literary elements, and then you would say ultimately illustrating, and you would have some kind of a theme basically as the universal idea. So you can see the whole template put all together. And then if you scroll down, you can see where it says Q1. So on the AP Lit exam, there are 3 essay questions. The first one, Q1, deals with poetry. The second one, which is Q2, deals with prose. And the third one, which is Q3, deals with, it's kind of like an open-ended where you would choose a book that you read on your own, and you would address the prompt using the book that you read. So here's the first example, which has to do with poetry. So it says, in her poem, The Century Quilt, Marilyn Waniak weaves together natural symbolism, describes familial memories, and conveys the speaker's hope for her future in order to showcase her role in the development of the quilt's multifaceted pattern, ultimately illustrating that family is comprised of the intricate interplay between past, present, and future generations. Okay, so you can kind of see how he's got the 3 parts of the prompt or of the template working together. Here is another example. It says, throughout the poem, the story, Lee contrasts the father's yearning to appease his apparent failure while shifting points of view and repeatedly exposing a son's simple request in order to expose the loving misunderstanding that dictates their interaction, ultimately illustrating that intense anxiety often causes individuals to be disconnected from reality. Okay, here's an example from Q2, which is more what we're working with this evening, since we're looking at excerpts from prose. It says, in the excerpt from the story Cherry Bomb, Maxine Clare presents a childish philosophy, contrasts a juvenile lesson with a harsh reality, and presents an arduous journey along with an attitude of gratefulness in order to characterize the narrator's childhood as a time of blissful and naive adventure, ultimately illustrating that nostalgia brings comfort and joy to a mature mind. Here is another one from the Telltale Heart, which you may have read. It says, in the Gothic horror story Telltale Heart, Edgar Allan Poe narrates the perspective of a hell-bent, self-righteous psychopath, details the mastery and confidence by which the intruder carves his victim, and explores the murderer's sense of paranoia and guilt in order to create a maniacal, yet self-justified narrator, ultimately illustrating that guilt and self-deprivation are oftentimes proportionately punishing traits when bonded with gruesome secrecy and pride. And then for Q3, I'll just give you one example. It says, in the novella of Mice and Men, Steinbeck presents 2 mercy killings in order to showcase the deep care that the characters involved shared for one another, ultimately illustrating that companionship often requires immense sacrifice. So hopefully those examples help you on some level. What we are going to do is we are going to make an attempt ourselves, and we're actually going to look at a former prompt. So the prompt that we're going to look at tonight comes from the 1995 exam. Really quickly though, before we do that, when you're writing your essay, I always tell my students that because you're writing a timed essay and you don't have a lot of time, you have about 40 minutes per question, I encourage them to just have that thesis be their introduction. So I know your English teacher probably has taught you to have, you know, more to your introduction. But again, if we're thinking about how can we maximize the time we have, I encourage my students to just write a thesis as their introduction. And then you're going to work on your body paragraphs. So for each body paragraph, you're going to have a main idea or a claim, and your topic sentence should come back or connect back to your overall thesis sentence. You're going to have evidence or a quote, which should be a specific quoted example. You're going to have analysis and commentary, which then explains why the example is important and how the author is using the example to construct his or her overall meaning. You may have some last thoughts. It is best to repeat the evidence and the commentary at least once more. So usually, you'll have, your main idea, evidence analysis, and then some kind of a last thought before you move on to your next body paragraph. So as far as steps to writing about characterization go, we want to start by gathering evidence. Okay, so I said here we've done this 2 ways, although we really only did it 1 way. So hypothetically, you would have used the character iceberg, right? Like you could have used that as a way of gathering evidence.